The moment that changed everything wasn't loud, it wasn't public, it wasn't even meant to be seen, but when that final clause was rewritten, when that single name vanished without a trace, insiders say it revealed something far more dangerous than a simple edit. It exposed a quiet fracture of trust at the very heart of the monarchy, a fracture so deep that even Queen Elizabeth II herself made the decision to erase someone from her legacy forever. Because this wasn't just a will, it wasn't just paperwork. This was the final voice of a monarch who had spent over 70 years watching, remembering, and silently judging everything around her. And according to those who claim to have seen the internal notes, that final revision was not about money, not about assets, not about inheritance. It was about trust being broken in a way that could never be repaired again. And the whispers didn't start with headlines. They started quietly, in legal rooms and hushed conversations between people who suddenly realized that something inside that sealed document didn't match what they had always believed. Because earlier drafts, the ones never meant to leave palace walls, reportedly included a name that everyone assumed would remain there. A name connected to years of proximity, years of access, years of quiet influence within the royal circle. And yet, in the final version, it was gone. Not moved, not reduced, not redefined. Gone. And here's where the story takes a darker turn. Because insiders now claim that the removal wasn't part of a routine update, it wasn't a technical correction, it wasn't even a strategic adjustment. It happened after what they describe as a final breakdown of confidence. A moment, or perhaps a series of moments that forced the queen to do something she rarely did, draw a permanent line. Think about that for a second. This is a woman who endured decades of scandals, controversies, and public storms without ever publicly turning against her own. She absorbed it all. She stayed silent. She maintained that unbreakable image of stability. So what could possibly push someone like that to quietly rewrite a clause that would decide who remains part of her legacy and who disappears from it completely? Those close to the situation suggest it wasn't one explosion. It was something colder, slower, a pattern, a shift. Small decisions that started to form a picture. Conversations that felt different. Actions that didn't align with the expectations of the institution she had spent her life protecting. And the queen, as always, didn't react immediately. She observed, she waited, and she remembered. Because that's what made her different. She didn't respond to noise, she responded to patterns. And once that pattern became clear, insiders claim she made the most controlled, most final decision she could make. She removed that name not with anger, but with certainty. And the most chilling detail? There was no explanation written into the will. No dramatic note, no accusation, just silence. The kind of silence that says everything without saying anything at all. But buried in the margin, according to those who saw the internal review notes, there was something else. A brief handwritten addition. Not legal language, not financial direction, just a personal annotation. And that note, they say, carried a message that now echoes through every corner of this unfolding mystery. Trust, not loyalty, not family, trust. Which means whatever happened behind those palace walls, whatever decision or action triggered that rewrite, it crossed a line that even decades of shared history could not repair. And once that line was crossed, there was no coming back. Inside Buckingham Palace, the reaction was not explosive. It was controlled, carefully contained. But insiders describe a shift, a quiet realization among those who understood what that missing name actually meant. Because in royal terms, being removed from a will isn't just about inheritance. It's about position. It's about belonging. It's about whether you are still considered part of the structure that protects the crown. And suddenly, one person wasn't. Some say those present during the internal review recognized it instantly. Others were caught off guard, still holding on to the assumption that certain relationships were untouchable. But the document didn't argue. It didn't explain. It simply confirmed that something had already changed long before the public ever knew. And here's where it becomes even more unsettling. Because according to insider claims, the timing of that final revision matters. It didn't happen years earlier. It didn't happen in some distant phase of planning. It happened late, close to the end, at a moment when every decision carried weight, when every adjustment reflected a final judgment rather than an ongoing process. Which raises a question that no one inside the palace is willing to answer. What happened in those final years that turned quiet doubt into irreversible action? Because removing a name at that stage isn't hesitation, it's conclusion. And now, as fragments of this story continue to circulate, the focus isn't just on the missing name anymore. It's on the reason behind it. The moment, the conversation, the decision that made one of the most private figures in modern history take such a definitive step. Was it a betrayal? A disagreement? A pattern that became impossible to ignore? No one is saying it out loud, but everyone is asking. And maybe that's the most revealing part of all. Because for a monarch who built her entire legacy on silence, control, and quiet endurance, this final act wasn't loud, but it was absolute. One clause rewritten, one name erased, one message left behind that no one inside inside the palace can ignore anymore. And the deeper this story goes, the more it starts to feel like that missing name isn't just a mystery, it's a warning. And the more this story unfolds behind closed doors, the more it begins to feel like that rewritten clause wasn't just about the past, it was about controlling the future. Because what insiders are now quietly suggesting is that the Queen didn't just remove a name, she redirected an entire chain of influence that would have extended far beyond her lifetime. And that kind of decision doesn't happen unless something irreversible has already taken place. Because think about the weight of that moment. A monarch who spent decades protecting balance, avoiding open conflict, and absorbing pressure from every direction suddenly makes a silent but surgical move that alters the course of her private legacy, and she does it at a stage in life where every decision is final, every signature is permanent, and every revision becomes part of history that cannot be undone. That is not hesitation. That is not confusion. That is clarity born from something that crossed a line too deep to ignore. And insiders now claim that after that clause was rewritten, something else changed inside the palace atmosphere itself. Not publicly, not in the headlines, but internally. Access patterns shifted. Conversations became more restricted. Certain doors that were once open no longer were. It wasn't announced. It wasn't acknowledged, but it was felt. The kind of shift that only those inside those walls would recognize, the kind of quiet distancing that speaks louder than confrontation ever could. Because this is how the monarchy operates when things break beneath the surface. It doesn't explode outward. It contracts inward. It adjusts silently. It redraws boundaries without ever explaining why those boundaries needed to be drawn in the first place. And yet, despite all of that silence, fragments have started slipping out. Not confirmations, not official statements, just pieces, hints, patterns that people close enough to the situation have begun to connect. And what those patterns suggest is something far more unsettling than a simple personal disagreement. They suggest that the Queen's final decision may have been influenced by concerns that extended beyond family dynamics and into something much larger, something tied to the long-term stability of the institution itself. Because when that handwritten note referenced trust, it wasn't casual, it wasn't emotional, it was foundational. Trust in the Queen's world meant reliability under pressure, alignment with the Crown's purpose, the ability to carry responsibility without creating risk. And if that trust was broken, then the consequences weren't temporary, they were permanent. And that's exactly what this looks like. A permanent removal, a permanent silence, a permanent message embedded into a document that was never meant to be public but somehow became the center of one of the most quietly explosive mysteries the royal family has faced in years. And here's where it becomes even more intense. Because according to those familiar with the aftermath, the individual whose name disappeared didn't immediately know. The decision had already been finalized, the document sealed, the outcome locked in place before the realization ever reached them, which means by the time the truth surfaced, there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to change. Just the reality that a place once assumed to be secure had already been erased. And inside palace corridors, that realization didn't trigger chaos. It triggered something colder, a kind of understanding that this wasn't a reaction, it was the final step in a process that had been unfolding quietly for years. A process that most people never noticed because it never demanded attention. It just slowly redefined relationships, expectations, and roles until one day, the outcome was already decided. Because that's how decisions like this are made at that level. Not in moments of emotion, but in layers of observation. Not through confrontation, but through conclusion. And now, as this story continues to circulate, the silence from the palace is becoming part of the story itself. No denial, no confirmation, just the same controlled stillness that has always protected the monarchy from external pressure. But this time, that silence feels different. It feels heavier. Because the questions it's protecting are more personal than usual, more precise, more difficult to dismiss. Who was removed? What exactly happened in those final years? And what did the Queen see that convinced her this step was necessary? Because whatever that answer is, it was strong enough to override history, strong enough to override familiarity, strong enough to override whatever connection once justified that name being included in the first place. And that is not a small decision. That is a defining one. Some insiders even suggest that the rewritten clause wasn't just about exclusion, it was about protection. That by removing that name, the Queen was shielding the structure she had spent her entire life maintaining from a future risk that only she fully understood. A risk that may not have been visible to the public, but was clear enough to her to demand action. And if that's true, then this isn't just a story about someone being cut out. It's a story about something being prevented, which changes everything. Because now the focus isn't just on the past. It's on what might have happened if that name had stayed, what role that person might have played, what influence they might have carried into the next chapter of the monarchy. And suddenly, that missing name starts to feel less like a mystery and more like a piece of a much larger puzzle that no one has fully seen yet. And maybe that's why this story refuses to settle. Because it doesn't end with the will. It begins there. A single clause rewritten. A single name erased. A single decision made in silence that continues to ripple through conversations, assumptions, and unanswered questions long after the moment itself has passed. And somewhere behind all of that is the truth. A truth that wasn't spoken, wasn't explained, wasn't revealed, but was powerful enough to change everything anyway.